Hello and welcome to Days of Learning. I'm your host, David Nelson, and it is a joy to be here with the first podcast of Days of Learning. Recently, somebody asked me, well, how did you come up with the name Days of Learning? It's interesting. Much of it was due to the pandemic. We've had the phrase Days of Learning for some time, but Days of Learning referred to in-person learning sessions that we've had with community partners, with academic partners, where we got together and we learned together. Well, the pandemic and the COVID-19 that happened in late 2019 put that away and caused us to pivot. And so Days of Learning has turned into a podcast where we are going to talk about health, wellness, stress, any number of issues that are important to us in the health and wellness field as it relates to the biology of people, the psychology of people, the sociology of people, the spirituality of people, primarily in the aspect of how do we prevent disease and help people to be the best person that they can be. Days of Learning is sponsored currently by the 1815 grant, which is a grant focused from the Center for Disease Control and through the state of Wisconsin, where we are striving to prevent chronic illness, specifically diabetes, type 2 diabetes, and hypertension. I am so pleased to have as our first guest Dr. Christopher Simmons from Marquette University. Dr. Simmons and I have worked together for almost 15 years now. He tells a story where I came to see him week one with a good friend of ours, John Moyer, introduced me to Christopher Simmons. And we have been working together not only in the health and wellness field, but in the missions field, which I hope he'll talk a little bit about. But I have asked Dr. Simmons to join us today to talk about health and wellness from the perspective of exercise. What are some of the things that support exercise, especially on chronic illness prevention? But what are also some of the things that get into the way? I know that he'll bring some of his systems work into play, and he is comes to us with a background in exercise science. He works at the physical therapy science department at Marquette University, but he is also a community engaged researcher and someone who takes it to heart to learn from the community whenever he can. Welcome, Christopher.
Thanks, David. Good morning. Hi, everybody. I work at Marquette University in the Department of Physical Therapy. I've done so for the past 20 years. We met 15 years ago along with Brett Fuller, I think same week, and have been doing physical activity, engaged research, and community work ever since. Exercise and physical activity wellness are an essential part of daily life, an essential part of daily life for everyone. And what we've seen with COVID is a number of different things that have both confounded the process of wellness via physical activity, but have also potentially created some opportunities for novel ways to engage. So I think that we're off to a really interesting topic today, and I think that there are ways to reframe what's happening to present opportunity in the area of wellness and physical activity.
Chris, I want to have you take the listeners back because you've been in this field for a while. Tell us how, when you entered the field, 20, 25 years ago, what was happening around that time that excited you about being in the field of health and wellness?
Sure, absolutely. So when I came out, I was a biomechanist by trade, meaning I studied and analyzed human motion. And my interest was really in performance enhancement. So when I began researching at the very start of my career, I was helping people to learn how to more effectively jump, to run, to lift, to be powerful, a lot of athletes. But what quickly became apparent to me was that there was a much broader component that I was missing and that wasn't a part of my research and my work, around wellness and around how people used physical activity to improve their quality of life, improve their interactions with others, and improve their function. So shortly after I started, we came into the field, or you came into Milwaukee when I was in the field, when the obesity epidemic was really kind of hitting home. So we'd gone through a period of fat-free diets that led to significant increases in sugar intake, significant increases not only in obesity, but in other chronic comorbidities such as diabetes type 2 and associated variables there. So we began to study childhood obesity. And when I began to study childhood obesity, I had training predominantly as a clinical researcher and or a performance researcher. So community engagement was something that I didn't have a lot of background in and had to learn on my own. It was a fascinating time because obesity was rampant. Wisconsin was routinely rated in the top third of most obese states in the nation. And we began to notice pretty quickly that there were significant disparities in lack of physical activity and obesity, specifically amongst people of color and people of low socioeconomic status, both in Milwaukee and throughout the nation. So that was my first area of focus. We began working on some childhood obesity related grants. I think you recall, David, one of the first projects we might have worked on together was the Milwaukee Food and Fitness Initiative, where we spoke with a number of children and families from a variety of different backgrounds, including Latinx families on the South Side, including African-American families on the North and Northwest side, and including Hmong families that were in multiple places throughout the city, to garner their opinions, their ideas, their attitudes, their beliefs about physical activity and exercise. Some fascinating developments there. Our biases and my real, pardon the expression, but the slap in the face to me that made me realize that I was in no way ready to be an effective community engaged researcher was a survey that we gave to our Hmong community that had a written term for exercise on it that we couldn't translate because our friends in the Hmong community didn't have a written term in their predominantly oral language for exercise. We had an agrarian community that worked on a daily basis and didn't get to the gym after working in Southeast Asia, coming to Milwaukee. And we wanted to fit a population into our terminology and our terms instead of understanding theirs. And that was a real introduction for me into having to become a better community partner, having to take the perspective and the context of those who come from a different place than I did. And it was really eye-opening and wonderful.
You know, let's unpack that a little bit. I want you to talk a little bit about the, can I say, the misperception that physical activity for one is physical activity for universal. Is that a fair statement to make?
Without question. You know, we can talk very quickly and very easily about the idea of internal bias and think about the fact that where we come from, what our background and what our perspective is tends to shape our beliefs. And the notion that physical activity and wellness are rooted in exercise, and specifically in exercise and sport. It's a shame we don't have Brett Fuller on here. He'd already be rallying against this, right? Are really misguided. And they come from the educational system and they come from the sports and the sports leagues that tended to accompany beginning education through high school education in American youth. What is really important to understand is that we have grown into a much broader perspective on what wellness is. Wellness used to be very physiological. The study that we did in exercise science was really started, and you'll appreciate this, people after your own heart, by runners and by cross-country skiers who were primarily physiologists looking at aerobic capacity and looking at prolonged cardiovascular exercise as the route to wellness. And what we found over time is that wellness is much broader than cardiovascular capacity. And in fact, we found that people that tended to be very high performing in terms of cardiovascular capacity oftentimes weren't well in one or a number of different areas. So a good example of this is somebody that goes out and runs 40 miles a week may have a wonderful cardiovascular capacity, but if we're not considering how they treat their body the rest of the time when they're not running, the other things that they do, not only physically, but in terms of managing their stress, managing their social interactions, managing their spirituality and connections, managing their physical strength, managing their nutrition and their bone health, and other issues, they can really be unwell, but high performing. So we made a quick distinction between high performance, meaning being good at something physical, whether you can shoot a basket, you can kick a soccer ball, you can run a marathon, and being well. So as that evolved, we had to begin to understand that my perception of wellness, based on my background and my interactions, I was an athlete and played athletics all the way through, is very different than somebody who might be sitting right next to me who may have had a different context coming up. So we started to integrate and entertain ideas that wellness could be achieved via things like dance, via things like gardening, via things like playing with children in the yard. Whereas we had a very, very prescriptive and very sport exercise-based connotation prior. So that was an important realization for me. And it's one that we still struggle with in the field. We've still got physical educators today who believe that unless you are physically active in a sport sense, you're not well. So we're working and pushing against that.
Yeah, let me ask you, Chris. I want to go back even further, but I want to stay on this. Do you think we do a disservice to the community around this wellness as being much broader when we have such a focus on sport?
I think we absolutely do. You know, sport really benefits a small percentage of the population. And you can see this in youth sports. We've really professionalized our children. We've radicalized youth sport where it used to be an opportunity for kids to engage and play. And we've now got kids as young as 8, 9, 10 years old traveling the country winning trophies because competition has replaced wellness. When we do this, we create a weeding out program that almost invariably at very early ages tells some students that some children that they're not worthy and that they're not active and that they're not athletic and that they don't belong in this venue. And what that does is from a really early age is it socializes kids away from physical activity. It actually negatively stigmatizes physical activity for kids. This is the same reason we used to see people use push-ups or running laps as punishment in sport and exercise. And we've had to move decidedly away from that because we want to create positive connections and connotations with physical activity. And the reliance on sport really, really doesn't do that. Maybe the best example of this, sorry, David, one more thing. Maybe the best example of this is the use of really predatory games in sport and exercise. You can have Brett Fuller on to do a full podcast on dodgeball and the perils of dodgeball. But what we do is we take kids that are better prepared for sport-like skills, such as throwing a ball, and we pit them against students who might not be as prepared. And then we let them target those kids and throw a ball at them to knock them out of the competition. It's really the antithesis of what wellness is about.
Yeah, it's that form of when you said predatory games, it's a form of bullying and it's a form of power and dynamics. So in that particular instance, let's stay on this a little bit longer. Is there an answer to this, Chris?
I think there are answers to this. I think for us to suggest that there is a one-size-fits-all answer to wellness and physical activity would be both naive and it'd be really biased. I think that there's certainly room for sport in exercise and wellness. And sport can teach a lot of wonderful things. It can teach perseverance. It can teach teamwork. It can teach striving, goal setting, and a whole host of other things. But sport isn't the only means by which we can do this. And in fact, there are a lot of unhealthy lessons that come from sport. So what we have to consider is what are the broad and inclusive ways that we can teach wellness and physical activity? Wellness and physical activity can be, again, getting out into that garden. It can be taking a bike ride. It can be taking a long walk with a spouse, with a partner, with a friend. And all of these things can be considered and built into a comprehensive wellness program. One of the other ways that I'd urge us to consider that we don't consider wellness often enough is that physical activity can be a moderator or a mitigator of the effects of stress. COVID's a great example. People are isolated, people are indoors, and there needs to be a way for the body physiologically to deal with the stress that's placed on it. Physical activity can do that. But oftentimes I'll see my students at Marquette misuse physical activity as a stress reducer, not understanding that physical activity itself is a stressor to the system. So if you take an already stressed body and you add vigorous physical activity, you can actually further break down that body. And this is where the idea of social wellness, of psychological wellness, of spiritual and emotional wellness have to come into play, because then we can incorporate things like stress management, like meditation, like spirituality, that can help to balance and reduce stress in ways that might not be as physically taxing to the body.
So we're clear here. I think that you're not advocating for doing away with sport, but that sport needs to be put into the context and the perspective that everybody's not going to be a 4-minute miler, and everybody's not going to be able to play competitive sport when they become adults, for getting paid for play. But there is a role for sport in this idea of this comprehensive wellness program.
Without question, I think you hit on it perfectly. Sport is another opportunity for physical activity, which can lead to wellness. But it's just another opportunity. It's not the opportunity. It shouldn't be the primary opportunity, specifically when we look at the fact that it advantages the few at the expense of the many. 10% of people that play sports in high school are going to wind up playing that sport outside of high school when they're out in college or when they're adults, meaning that we don't have good transfer. And one of the things that we want to think about when we teach physical activity and wellness, specifically to children and adolescents, is the development of an orientation to a lifetime of wellness or lifetime activity. So if we're thinking about that football player that's training hard right now, getting ready for two-a-days for a fall football season, that may not be the best training for that same football player when he is 22, 25, 30, 40. And in fact, the injuries accrued by a contact sport like football may outweigh the benefits in the long run. So we want to think about sport as it is. It can be an essential part of a broader wellness picture, but it shouldn't be the picture.
Yeah, it shouldn't be thought of as the complete picture. And I really liked what you said, 2 points that I want to make, and we're going to ask you to give us some practical tips as we go forward. But you said something that I really resonated for me, is the idea of finding ways to be inclusive. So is the activity inclusive with which a lot of people can do it, and you can do it in a social setting? And I think the second thing, Chris, and we perhaps won't have time to do this, to talk about that orientation to lifetime activity, of how the activity, in terms of what is going on, how is it oriented at something that you can do across the lifespan, whether you be a young adult or adolescent, or whether you be someone in the middle of life, or whether you're being someone in at the latter parts of life. I want to go back, though. I want to go back further, because you said something about this slap in the face as a community engaged researcher. And even before that, you said something about people of color and low income people, and how obesity rates are higher in these groups. Chris, I always thought that obesity was about the choices that you make, and that if you put your mind to it, you don't have to be obese. Are you saying something different here?
I am absolutely saying something different. And it's interesting, because you're using, when you make this argument ad absurdum, right? The argument that is made by the hegemonic and the dominant culture to victim shame and victim blame, systems problem. So when we look at obesity and we look at the spread of obesity across the country and across the world, what we see are multiple systems problems colliding. And these systems problems have been created, and these systems problems are fraught with institutional racism, oppression, and other that target differentially different populations. So if we look in Wisconsin as a microcosm, or America as a microcosm of the world, we tend to see people of color African American populations, Latinx populations, Native American populations. We also see impoverished communities, communities with low socioeconomic status. So this can be white populations, but white populations that are poor or rural poor, that have far higher rates of obesity in men, women, and children than do wealthy suburban white folks. There's a reason for this, and there are multiple systems in place. First is our food system. And we can go all the way back to the destruction of the family meal through the incorporation of home economics classes. And home economics classes, instead of teaching people to effectively cook, scratch, to understand nutrition, taught consumerism in the first and the middle part of the last century, so that we took people away from preparing their own meals and brought them through the notion of fueling the economy to prepackaged, high sodium, high fat, unhealthy foods. The growth of that industry now to, if you walk down any cereal aisle at any supermarket, you'll see 500 different brightly colored packages of corn syrup and corn product, is shown best by the subsidies that we give to farmers to produce corn, actually benefiting the farmer and producing excess corn at a rate that's unsustainable. So now we're feeding people, and we're using this to fuel an economy, feeding people cheap food product, not food itself, but adulterated, chemicalized food product that makes people obese. We do the same thing with soft drinks. Walk into any corner store in the city of Milwaukee and you'll see a 79-cent 2-liter bottle of soda. But it'll be tough for you to find a gallon of milk. It'll certainly be tough for you to find fresh juice or fresh fruit. So if we think about these things, we have systems that deprive people of healthy choices when it comes to nutrition and force upon them toxic choices that not only bring about obesity, but bring about all the comorbidities related to obesity: high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease, pulmonary disease, asthma, diabetes, and other. Then we think about physical activity and think about environment. I live in a community in the North Shore of Milwaukee, and I believe we counted last, there were 19 parks that were walkable from my house that my kids could take part in physical activity in safely, effectively, and freely. If we walk into the central city, we've got parks that are dilapidated. We've got parks that aren't cared for. We've got school lots that, instead of having play equipment, grass fields, and turf for kids to play on, are cracked, empty parking lots with fences around them that don't resemble play areas. In fact, they resemble pens or a prison system. So when we think about systems, we have to think not only about food, we have to think about the built environment. Does the built environment, the things that we've created in the city, and or the things that we've relegated to people of color and people of low socioeconomic status in the central city, do they encourage physical activity or do they discourage it? So those are two examples, David, of systems that not only don't enhance physical activity and wellness, they actually forcibly reduce it.
You gave a couple of terms, and I want you to define them. I know I'm not going to ask you for a dictionary definition, but you said the idea of hegemonic control and victim shaming. Can you speak into both of those for our listeners so that they have some clarity about how some of these systems operate?
Absolutely. So let's start with hegemonic control. Hegemony would be the ruling of a ruling class or a powered majority of people, powered not necessarily numerical majority, but whether it's through wealth, whether it's through influence or other. In America, we have a hegemonic control that is based on the rule of the moneyed white male. We have a capitalist system that rewards capital and capital accumulation. So people with properties, people with money, people with influence in those spheres became powerful. And all of the systems that we set up, economic, social, educational, reform, incarceration, and other, are designed in no small way to perpetuate the rule of that group and of that class. A simple example might be, we have income taxes, but we've also got capital gains taxes. So we've got people with extra capital, with extra money, that can put money into a market and grow that money really, really rapidly through compound interest, and then pay significantly less on the earnings from that money. This advantages people that already have wealth. We had programs at the level of the federal government that incentivize wealthy white families, that incentivize white families to move away from the cities in what we called white flight. And they actually gave them discounts, low interest, sometimes interest-free loans to get out into suburbs, and didn't offer those same loans to people of color or people of really low socioeconomic status. We had other things like redlining we've talked about previously in Milwaukee, where we actually drew on maps areas that people of color could live, and then a whole bunch of areas where white people could live that people of color couldn't. And through these processes, these systems, we've created a significantly more unequal structure. If we look at schooling, we think about standardized testing, the ACTs and the SATs. My students, my children at a suburban school will take the ACT or a practice ACT 6 or 7 times before they see it in high school, and it's official to get them into college. Students of color in the central city and MPS might see it once or twice. So this becomes another sorting mechanism, because we also have in the suburbs the ability to pay tutors and pay review sessions to get our kids coached up to this test. So now they get into better schools and they perpetuate inequity. So these systems are designed to protect what we call the hegemony, which is the rule of this white moneyed class. I'm sorry, you had a second term. What was that one?
The idea of victim shaming.
Sure, victim shaming. The idea of personal responsibility. So let's think about the notion that someone who suffers from obesity is told that it's their fault and they just need to work harder. If we look, I'll give you the example of the near west side in Milwaukee, which is where Marquette's located and where I work. We've had for a long time what we call a food desert. What we found out is the same processes, the redlining and other things that we just talked about previously, led supermarkets to flee central city areas and move to suburban areas where wealthier customers would pay. So now we talk about making good food choices if you just eat healthy. And the response is walk into any corner store where people in the central city are forced to shop due to lack of access, and healthy objects aren't available. One of the things we did with Milwaukee Food and Fitness Initiative is we did fruit and vegetable audits in a bunch of corner stores throughout Milwaukee. And in most instances, we found little to no fruit and vegetable available. We found little in the way of milk availability. So if we've got areas where people don't have access to health, to physical activity, to healthy food, and then we shame them, right, for not being in better shape, not being a certain weight based on the white ideal of what body mass should look like, we're shaming the same people that we put into that situation through a series of racist, a series of institutionally oppressive policies and systems. That's victim shaming.
I want you to sum that up then, of how that plays out for communities of color and low-income communities in the realm of healthy eating and physical activity. What do we see then?
Where do we see it? I would say drive through any central city neighborhood and look at the proliferation of fast food restaurants. And look at the lack of supermarkets. Look at the lack of food choice. If you drive through any suburban area, look at the parks, look at the play spaces, look at the built environment and the things built to support physical activity. And then transition that, and again, look in a central city area and see the lack thereof. One interesting offshoot of this, David, and this might be a brief aside, but it's really fascinating to note because we are now well into a couple decades into this idea of gentrification, which is revitalizing areas that have been dilapidated. So if we think about central city areas, this means people move in, developers move in, buy property at very low value, and then build it up and invite people to move back into the central city to revitalize it, to make it more vital and more appropriate for wellness. The problem with this is further institutionalized racism and oppression. And it actually, in many instances, if it's not done carefully and thoughtfully, even further marginalizes populations of color and low socioeconomic status populations. Because when we move people in and we create green spaces and we create markets, we create a market that requires people with significant capital to move into. So we get a bunch of young white families, young urban professionals that move in, but we don't talk about this, the other side of the coin of gentrification, which is displacement. There were a whole bunch of people in almost any central city area that lived in that space prior. Now, in most instances, we don't track, we don't care, and we don't question where those people go and what happens to them. So when we see this is really a forced colonialism. Once again, we come in, we invade, we build it the way we want it, and we watch as everybody that was there prior just disperses. We've done this again and again in this country.
So I want to ask you, and I really do want a yes or no answer, and I want you to go into it a little bit. We began the conversation talking about this comprehensive wellness program, comprehensive wellness, inclusive ways. And I kept thinking as you were talking, Chris, about this idea of hegemony and even the idea of revitalized neighborhoods. How hard it must be for people currently living in those neighborhoods to have a comprehensive wellness plan. Is it possible for someone living in an environment that puts them at such disadvantage to be holistically well?
I'm going to give you a personal answer and then a systems answer.
Sure.
There are always exceptions, right? And this is the falsified notion of American exceptionalism and the American dream. Anyone can pull themselves up by their bootstraps and be well. So we can see an example from any block in any city, in any neighborhood, in any place in the United States of somebody who made it and who was well. But from a systems perspective, from a community perspective, it is impossible to think about holistic wellness emerging from places that have been so systematically disinvested in, have been so systematically marginalized and oppressed. One thing we haven't even got into yet, David, and this is another podcast, is the impacts of stress, the impacts of trauma on the lives of people. And trauma and stress directly and negatively impact wellness. And we think of people that live in areas where there isn't business, where there's perception of unsafety, where there isn't green space or built environment hospitable to wellness, where there isn't easily accessible food, work, and other. We import stress. We inject stress into those areas. So now when we look at the health of mothers having children, when we look at the health of those children once they're born, when we look at the health of families and neighborhoods, we see the direct impacts of stress on reduced health. And so this is a long way of saying, no, I don't think from a systems perspective, unless we change systems, we can expect that someone in a situation who is marginalized and oppressed can realize wellness.
As you're talking about this, I'm thinking of the various pieces, because many of the listeners will think of physical activity as the way to lose weight. That's what wellness is. But what you're saying here is that there are really multiple components to this idea of a comprehensive wellness model of which people can engage in to be healthy.
Without question. So there are multiple frames, and these oftentimes we'll talk about these if we see Davison and Birch in my head, right? We've got these concentric circles and interrelated circles of individual, family, neighborhood, community, systems, all interacting on each other. So the simplest example, and this is one of our errors, again, things we had to learn from, Milwaukee Food and Fitness Initiative. We wanted to talk to kids 15, 16 years ago about their food choices. Kids were eating Flamin' Hot Cheetos. They were eating Mountain Dew on the north and the northwest side. And we talked to kids and wanted to know why they picked the foods they did and what they thought about nutrition. We talked to kids at MPS schools, and what did they say? It was simple. They weren't thoughtful about that. They were worried about getting to school safety. They were worried about someone harassing them, someone hurting them, potentially someone killing them in their neighborhood. And what we found out is that these things can't exist in isolation. All of these factors are interrelated. And I bring it back because if we're talking about weight status or physical activity, We have to go back several layers to much more elemental values and variables that impact the lives of people. The simplest that I'll go back to, and that we've talked about a bunch, you and I, is housing. If people are housing insecure, if they are consistently forced to move, if they are evicted, if they're living in housing that is unsafe, unhealthy, unclean, whether it's lead in the water, lead in the paint, whether it is a neighborhood that isn't hospitable to physical activity and wellness, how are they supposed to get a good night's sleep, get rest, feel safe, reduce their stress, be physically active, make healthy food choices, and then become well? So if we can't manage things as basic as housing, as food, and as safety, it's ludicrous for us to think that we're just going to impact wellness via a physical activity or exercise program. Or
So
even
perhaps part of that control that you speak of is a control of the health of a community based upon the issues that are at play. Take housing, for example, and I've maintained that a stable housing is the cornerstone, is the foundational principle to good health of individuals and communities.
I would wholeheartedly agree. And from a systems perspective, we can use Milwaukee because Milwaukee is a perfect example of what's wrong with housing, specifically housing for oppressed populations in the country. We've got federal aid designed to support children and families, specifically those in the central city, that's built on the notion and built on the calculation that 30% of income each month should go to housing. In Milwaukee, due to limited housing stock, due to substandard housing, due to rampant evictions, most people in impoverished neighborhoods pay upwards of 70% of their income to housing. So if we think about wellness, we've now got a situation by which landlords are charging vastly too much money for properties that they don't care for, properties that oftentimes are infested, properties with things that don't work, properties with stairs that are breaking and other. We've got all kinds of situations where we've got substandard housing that people now have to pay 2 or 3 times what they might otherwise normally have to pay for, leaving them less money to make healthy food choices, less money to engage in physical activity, less money for other lifetime essentials. So now let's add to that the fact that we've got a system that allows landlords for any reason to evict people from that housing. Okay, let me give you an example. In Milwaukee, the book Evicted spoke of this, but it still happens today. Victims of domestic violence. Landlords can evict the victims of domestic violence, stating that they're causing a problem, despite the fact that they're a victim. This is a classic example of the victim shaming we talked about before. Once people are evicted from a property, they become now official denizens of the unofficial housing market in Milwaukee, which means that they don't sign leases, they pay cash, and they pay significantly more than they'd otherwise pay. And now landlords can evict them anytime they want with no reason because it's not on the books. Our landlords in Milwaukee use Chicago-style evictions at some of the worst properties, meaning they don't ask people to leave and give them a time to get out. They come in and they pry the door to their home or their apartment off, so that anybody from community can come in and get their things. So if we think about this, again, these are oppressive systems that come into place that don't allow people the security, the safety, the stress relief, the financial and the emotional, social, and physical resources to be well.
Thank you. Do you feel that people who can make a change to these systems think about this comprehensive wellness of the individuals and the system?
Do I think that people that can make the change, are you asking me if you think they have interest in making the change?
Well, I wonder if people are aware of the connectedness of the system plays. For example, you had mentioned stress and the stress of health and the stress that comes from an unstable housing environment. I wonder if people make the connection between health and some of these community factors that play into health.
I think that a lot of people don't. I think that people, and I think that the problem is so big and so difficult and so complex, David, that people tend to focus on the 1 or 2 things that they do or that they can do and hope that they're making a difference. I'll give you an example. You and I both work for Freedom's Community Pantries, and we are a food pantry. We are a safety net food provider for people with food insecurity. And safety net food provision is a baseline aid process and support process for families who don't have enough to eat. For families who are hungry, let's call it what it is. Let's call it hunger. But that's one small portion of a larger problem, right? Like we said, if we're not talking about housing, talking about safety, talking about education and opportunity and access, while we continue to provide food, if we're not thinking about other services or other supports that can build capacity in neighborhoods, are we able to create broader change? So I think there are a lot of institutions that are doing that. They're doing small parts, but I think that we're not connected in the way we need to be to build capacity in neighborhoods, build capacity in families, in schools, and in societies to create change. Now, what I would argue is this, and this is my belief, it's no one else's, but I really believe that the people that make decisions and make policies that protect the hegemony, I believe they're well aware of the interrelatedness of these things. And I believe that they use these things to enact and continue to enable their rule by disabling others.
So connecting to that, because one of our sponsors has to do with chronic disease, and specifically type 2 diabetes and hypertension. So we can imagine, and if it would have you give us your thoughts around this connection between obesity and chronic disease, and then link it to the systems that you speak of.
Sure. So if we think about, let's use a chronic disease, we'll use diabetes type 2 as an example of a chronic disease. What do we know? Diabetes type 2 is far more prevalent in African-American populations in Milwaukee and in the nation. It's far more apparent and it's far more regular in low-income populations in Milwaukee and in the nation. So if we think about this, let's link it to systems. We've got a garden variety resident in Milwaukee who is obese or morbidly obese, based on numbers, who is more likely to suffer type 2 diabetes based on potentially race, based on socioeconomic status. Let's look at the neighborhood and the life that that person has to lead in Milwaukee, in the poorest neighborhoods in Milwaukee. We don't have access to healthy foods. Even if there's healthy food close by, I'll give you an example. We've got the Sendix on the near west side near Marquette. Well, cut up fruit is $8 a pound there, and gallons of milk are $4 and $5. It may be there physically, but it doesn't mean it's there and within the reach of somebody with low socioeconomic status. So these are systems that withhold healthy food. Let's think about housing. We've got somebody that's paying 70 to 80% of their income for housing in that space. So they're not able to make decisions on health. Let's give the example of buying healthy food, but let's also give the example of, which is so commonly put out there, why don't you just join a gym? Well, there aren't gyms in the central city, and by the way, gyms cost too much. Gyms are extravagances and they're ancillary costs for people with disposable income. So if we're thinking about places to work out, it becomes a problem. Let's think about transportation. We want to get to school, we want to get to a job, we want to get to that park, because parks don't tend to locate themselves, or at least quality, healthy, safe parks don't tend to locate themselves in the central city. Then we've got problems with access because cars cost money, transportation costs money, buses cost money, they take time. Let's think about housing instability. If we've got a person who is evicted during a school year for a child, during a job year, what do we see? We see a disruption in physical activity, a disruption in wellness, a disruption in eating. We then see a disruption in academic performance. And what we'll see in some households and in some spaces in Milwaukee is children that go to 2 or 3 different schools during the course of a year. So now we're limiting the ability to learn. We're limiting the ability to gain education. And what we found is increased education increases income levels. It increases wellness levels. It decreases comorbidity levels. So we're directly and indirectly influencing all those things through multiple systems.
All right. So we know that there are challenges. one of the things that we want to do on this show is to provide people with learnings, the hope for something different. Chris, I'm going to have you put your back to your days of performance, and let's give people the support that they need in order to make the changes that they needed to do. So where do you start with to have your students work with people with where they are? Can you let's coach somebody. Coach me up.
Sure. Well, I mean, first things first, let's talk about cultural humility. Understand somebody's background and their context and where they come from. What does wellness mean to that person, to that person in the context of their family and their neighborhood? We can talk about body shapes. We've gotten for a long time have had a Eurocentric kind of colonial white impression of what body fat should be and what healthy bodies look like. Many other cultures have different ideas. We have to start out by accepting that. But then we also have to sell. And when I talk to my students, we talk about this all the time. Let's not sell aesthetics. Let's not sell performance. Let's not sell you'll do this or you'll lose weight. Let's talk about wellness and quality of life. We talked about diabetes type 2. One of the primary tools we can use to combat diabetes type 2 is low intensity exercise, meaning you don't have to go to the gym for 2 hours. You don't have to sprint. But if you get out and you walk every day for an extended period of time, if you do low intensity physical activity, again, we can go back to this gardening or other, we can significantly reduce incidence of type 2 diabetes. And understanding and helping people to learn the benefits of exercise when it comes to weight status, comorbidity, and other becomes a really important task. But we have to do so in a way that's approachable, in a way that people want to hear and will embrace. And we have to do things that are fun and exciting. One of the things that you and I have done when we talk to high school students, about physical activity, in many instances, they dread it. We've taken the fun out of it by making physical activity and physical education about performance and sport and competition. If we can find a way to frame physical activity as fun with your family, fun doing tasks that you enjoy, so you're not making them work. Now we make it the easy choice and we remove barriers to physical activity. We see this a lot for adolescent girls. The use of dance in physical activity classes for adolescent girls increases participation and it increases enjoyment of the class. So can we find things that kids, adolescents, and families want to do and want to do together? If we can do that, then I tell my students to take focus off things like scale weight, to take things like focus off things like look at yourself in the mirror every day, because what we're doing is we're judging against a falsified ideal and against an ideal that oftentimes isn't nearly aligned or contextually aligned with the person, the family, the culture that we're coaching or that we're working with.
Nor is it obtainable.
And is almost never obtainable. If we think about the ideals that we see in magazines, on the internet, in social media, they're almost always falsified.
So people have the notion that being physically fit, if you will, being physically well means that I got to spend a lot of time, I got to go to a gym, and I got to lift heavy weights. How do you debunk that for people to? You talked about fun with the family, but
yeah.
Aren't there components where you want to build into things that they already do?
Without question. And they can be simple things. I mean, we've done things like, and there are all kinds of studies on this, taking the stairs instead of taking the elevator is a real choice, and it can have profound health impacts. Parking further away in the parking lot and walking into a store, into a space can have profound health impacts. So it doesn't have to be large change. Now, there's room for if somebody wants to be a bodybuilder, they can do that, and they can theoretically be well too. But because you're muscular doesn't mean you're well. We went back to that argument we had earlier. So the framing of this becomes essential for physical educators, for exercise scientists, and for people practicing wellness. It's what are your goals? And how do we frame your goals around health and improvement of quality of life? And how do we take steps to get there? For one person, that might be lifting heavy weights. But for a lot of people, that might just be getting out for a walk after dinner with your spouse, your partner, your friend. For some grandparents, that might be playing with kids in the yard. for somebody that might be joining the basketball or the football team. So we have to think about and take things into account that people are already doing. The struggle comes and the harder part comes when we have people, because a lot of America is this way, who are sedentary. And one of the things that we need to make clear to everybody is that bouts of exercise, meaning an hour of exercise, if the rest of your life is sedentary, isn't terribly effective. It's reducing periods of sedentarism, or periods where you're sitting and your heart rate and all your body functions are at baseline. It's reduction of those periods that actually improve wellness significantly. So if we can get people up and around instead of sitting in front of a television, sitting in front of a computer, sitting on their devices, we can actually improve physical activity, and we can improve wellness in many instances more than we could if they sat for 20 hours a day and went to the gym and worked out vigorously for one. So that's a message that we need to impart to.
So you're telling people that one of the important things that they need to do is get up?
Get up and get moving. Yes. It doesn't need to be a sprint. It doesn't need to be a run. Meaning get up and move. Walk. I have a standing desk when I'm at work. I haven't been at work for a long time. I find myself sitting a lot here more. But I get up and I take a walk. I'll take a walk around the block. I'll walk through the house, and I'll get up and do some things just so I break up that sedentary period and get my body active. And getting your body active increases health, decreases stress, increases immune function. And this is important considering COVID, right? So it's doing these things like getting active on a regular basis. That doesn't have to be high intensity exercise. You don't have to sweat. You don't have to go to the gym. You don't have to lift maximum weights or run 10 miles. You can do small things that add up during the day that make you well.
So Chris, can you give us some recommendations about if you're saying, if some of our listeners are in their, I don't know, if they're in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, I don't care. Should they just begin, or do you want people to get some kind of clearance first to say that it's okay to be active?
So this is great. This is a really good question, David. And ACSM, American College of Sports Medicine, has really shifted on this in the past few years. It used to be specifically around cardiovascular and cardiopulmonary risk. We wanted to get distinct clearance before we got people started. But what they've done is, with the exception of high-risk populations and people that have already had cardiovascular risks and other, they still want people to go out and they want them to get seen before they start engaging in moderate to vigorous physical activity. But for almost all populations, just getting active. And again, this doesn't mean running sprints. It doesn't mean going and putting the most weight on a bar you can lift and lifting it. It means starting to move has been shown to be incredibly beneficial with incredibly low risk.
So you're saying if someone's been told that they have a diagnosis of some sort of illness like diabetes or heart disease, that they might want to get some, hey, I think you're okay to exercise.
I would even differentiate in most instances between diabetes and heart disease, because heart disease has a decidedly more acute potential negative impact or outcome, right? So if someone's got cardiopulmonary distress based on a diagnosis, meaning you've got partially blocked arteries, meaning you've had a cardiovascular incident, those are acute areas where we want people to go see professionals and get some advice on how to safely exercise. But for people with chronic conditions, and people have chronic conditions all over the place, low-level activity can actually be really beneficial. Type 2 diabetes, as long as people don't have comorbidities like really, really decreased circulation, if you've got tissue death or tissue damage in your feet, we have to be cognizant of those things. And this is where exercise scientists can help. But low-level activities like walking, low-level activities, if you've got access to a pool or water like swimming, these things can be incredibly beneficial. And so ACSM has really shifted away from trying to keep people from exercise before they get tested to getting people moving at low levels. And then if they have things come arise, then starting to look into what some of the problems that might arise are.
Yeah, and I know that you are not a medical doctor, so you're not dispensing medical advice here, but that idea of movement is something that's important. And if people have questions around anything that they may be experiencing when they move, whether it be shortness of breath or any kind of pain that's out of the normal, that you should seek support of your provider to make sure that everything's okay.
Absolutely. They absolutely should. And in absence of a provider, there are many people in the city who don't have providers or don't have a medical home. There are public health entities like the health department in Milwaukee or in the suburbs. And there are other spaces where you can go to seek that information and seek that help.
Yeah,
So that's important. You can go to someplace as simple as Walgreens. Now, many Walgreens within the city have medical practitioners, whether nurse practitioner, physician assistant, or other, there at given points during the week that might be able to answer some of those basic questions.
yeah, even pharmacists are doing more from behind the counter at the front of the counter. So if you're in your neighborhood, stop at your pharmacy and visit with your local pharmacist. They want to do more in the prevention area, and we will be having a pharmacist on the show. Chris, I have to get from you, and you don't know this is coming, but give us a win. Tell us, I want you to think of all of the students and all the places of people that you've interacted with. Give us a success story of somebody who embodied this idea of inclusive ways and comprehensive wellness, who maybe went from that proverbial couch potato to where they got some chronic illness under control. Could you have an example for us?
Sure. So one of the best examples is we did a fall prevention and a balance program around physical activity at the Milwaukee Christian Center with our Hmong and Southeast Asian seniors. So we had Hmong, Lao, Cambodian seniors. We also had some local Latinx seniors that joined the program. And we had people that were decidedly inactive, decidedly sedentary, a lot of whom were afraid to move, many of whom sat for the bulk of their day at the Milwaukee Christian Center Community Center. And whether they colored or did crafts or watched television, they weren't active. We started an activity program there that still runs today that got a group of 30 plus on any given day, 3 days a week, seniors doing chair and modified chair aerobics, taking walks around the facility. At the start, we had some hesitance, but people grew to love it. And so we had people that were more fit, more functional, able to move, had less falls and less fall risks, had better overall health. And it was incredibly rewarding to see, not only from the wellness perspective in terms of the physical, we also had a geographically isolated population in our refugee seniors who were relatively afraid of the neighborhood they were in and who didn't have a lot of interactions with people outside of their peer group. So we had our students come in, the students got to interact, we had good, meaningful connections there. We got the seniors out walking in community so that they started to become more comfortable in the neighborhoods that they were a part of. And we had two groups decidedly there, which are our Southeast Asian seniors and our Latinx seniors, interacting with each other in a meaningful way and talking. So it was absolutely wonderful, and can't be happier than I am with how that program has turned out and continues.
So I had forgotten about this story, but you had told me this one before. Oldest participant in that program?
So Charlie, he was one of our Latinx seniors, and Charlie would now be 98 years old, if I'm not mistaken. And Charlie never missed a day. Charlie was there all the time. So I haven't been back recently, but we had an intern there because of COVID. Nobody's been back recently, but we had an intern there in the fall who was working with Charlie, and Charlie would have been 97, if I'm not mistaken, at that time. He's 98 now. So yes, people of all ages and all ability levels took part.
That's a good story. Can you reinforce then that this idea of, I love the idea of inclusivity and comprehensive, but this idea of comprehensive wellness is something that you can do at any age, not just when you're a child or a young adult. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think it's not only something that you can do at any age, David. I think it's something that we need to do at all ages. I think it's something that we need to consider throughout the lifespan. We spend in the lives of children so much time disincentivizing physical activity. We force them to sit in desks and classrooms. We scold them when they get up and want to be active. Kids want to be active, and that's our natural state. They want to play. We work that out of us as we move into adulthood. I think we're now finally starting to see the error in our ways from a systems perspective. Let's keep us active. Let's keep us moving. Let's keep us thoughtful about stress and about emotional and social and spiritual health, and continue to grow throughout our lives. And we'll all be happier and healthier for it.
Thank you. That really summed it up well. My one question that I'm asking all of the guests on the show, since this is Days of Learning, what have you learned over the years around this topic of holistic wellness that you want to impart to the audience here?
It's a great question. So I've learned a lot of things. If I can boil it down to a couple take homes. Number one, the more I learn, the less I know. That is an absolutely simple lesson. I am humbled by the fact that every time I walk into a new space, I've got not one thing, but 10 things to learn from any person, any community, any neighborhood, any family I come into contact with. And that directly relates to the second part of it, which is this idea of inclusivity and broadening wellness can't be stated strongly enough. Wellness is different for everyone. Social, physical, emotional, spiritual wellness. And we have to respect others' perceptions and respect others' ideals of wellness. And until we interrogate our own biases and make certain that we don't use those to infect our judgment, we can't be open to the idea that we have to be inclusive and allow everybody's wellness to play a role in wellness for the system and wellness for society.
Thank you. This has really been an outstanding conversation that's meandered a little bit, but I think it goes back to this idea of how we think about wellness, not just as one thing, but the confluence of many things at which, if we want to be a well and healthy society, we have to think about these comprehensive issues. Chris, anything else before we end today that you want to share with the audience?
No, I'd just like to say thank you for having me on. This is great. I love the opportunity, and I'm hoping that anybody that sees this that's interested, let's start more conversation. Always interested in having this conversation.
Chris, I know that if people want to find you, you're on social. You want to give out your some of the ways that people can connect with you?
I think I'm at Simmons on Twitter. That's the only social media I have left at this point, but you can certainly reach me at my address, which is christopher.simmons@marquette.edu, my email address, and get in contact with me that way.
Yeah, I can tell you that he's active in Twitter, and it's a good way to better understand both some of the things that he spoke of today around the control and the systems that are at play. Chris, it has been such a joy. You are such a longtime friend, and I value not only your friendship, but every time I'm around you, I learn something new. So I know more as a result of hanging out with you. So I'm going to hang out with you more. And I hope you'll come back again, and we'll have that conversation with you and me and Mr. Fuller. We'll carry on and perhaps get Miss Yvonne Greer as well.
That'd be great. The same to you, David, and look forward to it. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everybody. This has been David Nelson, and this is Days of Learning. And this has really been a really good conversation for us to engage in, to talk about the idea of quality of life and how we can be inclusive as a society in order to not to only be healthy and well, but how we can change the social norms around what it means for health and wellness and prevention of disease. I want to thank our sponsors from the 1815 grant and my sponsorship from my employer, the Medical College of Wisconsin. If you want more information, you can reach me at danelson@mcw.edu. And until next time, continue to be well, continue to be healthy, and God bless.